I'm Bo Johnson. Let me begin with something personal, because this is not theory. It's understanding based upon experience. In 2012, I was prosecuted by the federal government under two criminal statutes, 26 U.S.C. 7203, willful failure to file, and 26 U.S.C. 7212, obstruction of the administration of the Internal Revenue laws. Neither statute had the delegated regulatory authority required to apply to me or to any private individual born in one of the 50 states. How do I know? Because the government's own book proves it. As I said in the last video, it's the Parallel Table of Authorities and Rules, the PTAR. It is published by the Office of the Federal Register, and its only purpose is to show which statutes have valid implementing regulations. And here is the fatal truth. Section 7203 maps to no regulation at all. Section 7212 maps only to 27 CFR, the codes governing alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and excise commodities, not the income tax. In 2011, I showed this to the pastor of the church I attended, and he looked at the PTAR and said, "Maybe it's a typo." That's the level of ignorance Americans are trapped in. And not because people are foolish, but because the government has spent decades ensuring that no one sees the missing link. Everyone has been conditioned. There is no delegation of authority, no regulation, no jurisdiction. And yet the prosecution in my case moved forward. My attorneys, including Randy Cargill, supposedly the second in his class at West Point, refused to raise the argument. He and his assistant, Andrea Harris, told the jury that my beliefs were quote-unquote crazy, instead of presenting my good faith understanding as required under Cheek versus United States, which states that a sincere misunderstanding of the tax law negates criminal willfulness. They abandoned the only defense recognized by the Supreme Court. They refused to challenge jurisdiction. They refused to introduce the PTAR. They even refused to question jurisdiction. In the end, it was a slaughter, not a trial. But now let's move from personal history to legal reality. Here is the truth. A criminal statute under 26 U.S.C. cannot be enforced unless a regulation first creates a legal duty. This is not my theory. This is United States Supreme Court doctrine. You can refer to United States versus Mirsky, U.S. versus Grimald, California Bankers Association versus Schultz. These decisions establish a simple rule of law. A criminal penalty cannot create the duty. The duty must be created by valid regulation, and that regulation must identify who is subject, define what activity creates the duty, state where the jurisdiction exists, be published in the Federal Register under the Federal Register Act, and be authorized by Congress through a formal delegation. This is black letter administrative law, and this is why the IRS collapses. The PTAR reveals the missing regulations. Section 7203, willful failure to file, shows no regulation, no implementing rule, no delegated authority, and no jurisdictional statement. Translation: there is no regulation that requires private individuals to file. Yet, 7203 claims you could be punished for not doing so. You cannot willfully violate a duty, though, that was never legally in existence. Now let's go to Section 7212, obstruction. This one is even more outrageous. The PTAR maps 7212 exclusively to, as I said, 27 CFR, parts 40, 41, 44, 45, and 46, all dealing with tobacco, alcohol, firearms, bonded warehouses, and import and export regulated commodities. Not income tax, not wages, not individuals in the states. When I pointed this out to my lawyers, pastors, and educated professionals, I was met with blank stares. No, by the way, it's not a typo. But here's the part no one tells you. The courts will not allow the PTAR to be introduced as evidence. Why? They claim it's not binding. It's only a research tool. It may confuse the jury. But the real reason is simple. If the jury learned that the regulations do not exist, the prosecution would collapse instantly. Because without delegation, there is no duty. Without a duty, there is no willfulness. Without willfulness, there is no crime. The courtroom system must exclude the PTAR because it proves the government lacks the authority it is pretending to enforce. That is why my defense attorneys never raised it. That's why judges shut it down. That is why prosecutors avoid discussing regulations. They know the missing delegation is fatal. Title V, the Administrative Procedure Act, makes this even worse for the IRS. You see, under Title V, all regulations binding the public must be published in the Federal Register. An agency cannot enforce an unpublished rule. An agency cannot enforce an unpublished delegation. A statute is not enforceable unless its regulation is properly issued. This means a criminal prosecution under Title 26 cannot lawfully occur unless Congress delegated authority to the Treasury. Treasury issued a regulation. The regulation was published. The regulation applies to the defendant, and the jurisdiction is clearly stated. But the IRS has none of this for 7203 or 7212. Delegation orders do not save the IRS. IRS delegation orders do not create jurisdiction. They do not create a duty. They do not expand statutory authority. They do not apply to private individuals. And they do not replace published regulations. Courts have repeatedly held that internal delegation cannot expand external authority. The IRS tries to bridge the gap with internal memos, manuals, and policies, but none of these have the force of law. So how does the government prosecute? Here's the strategy. They present the statute to the jury. They hide the missing regulations. They rely on presumption, not proof. They bar the PTAR from evidence. They prevent delegation challenges. They silence cheek good faith defenses. They rely on defense attorneys who do not understand the regulatory system. This is not justice. This is jurisdiction by intimidation. The kill shot is the Liberty Dialogue's principle. A statute without delegation cannot reach the people. A regulation without statutory authority cannot bind the people. A prosecution without both cannot constitutionally stand. Yet this is exactly how the IRS operates every day. The PTAR reveals the missing delegation. The Administrative Procedure Act proves the requirement. The courts suppress the evidence. And the American people suffer under a system built on presumption, not law. This is why the Liberty Dialogues exist. This is why your statement of understanding is essential. And this is why truth will prevail. And as always, may truth reign supreme.